Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us online today for Sovereign Strategies Lessons from Norway's $2 trillion fund. My name is Siobhan Choi, President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council. Our council was founded in 1958 by the late Evangeline Atwood, who believed that educating our community about world affairs is essential for strong, informed citizenship. Today, our mission continues to bring the world to Alaska and spark curiosity, understanding, and engagement in global issues. We're thrilled to have you all with us today virtually, and we're especially grateful to our speakers who are joining us later in the day from New York and Norway. I will keep these remarks brief because I know we're in for a dynamic conversation and I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. You can submit those questions at any point by typing them into the Q&A box, and we will also invite some participants to come on camera to ask their questions live. If you're interested in doing that, simply use the raise your hand feature or send us a message and we will bring you on at the appropriate time. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Paul Marcussen and Roar Wold, whose bios can be found on our website. And we are also honored to have Lise Kristiansen here today, Honorary Consul of Norway in Alaska, to moderate the discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's guests.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you so much. And congratulations on being named the President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council. I am so thrilled to see you at the helm, and I really can't wait to see all of those great programs you have on your docket. So congratulations, Siobhan. Fabulous choice, Alaska World Affairs Council. And I'm also really excited to be here today to moderate today's program. For a little bit of context, for those of you who aren't in Alaska, today's program is one Alaskans have been asking for years now. I remember when the Institute of the North took a delegation from Alaska to Norway to learn from their fund. And at that time, Alaska's permanent fund, which started receiving oil revenues in the 70s, about 20 years before Norway, had about $50 billion in our fund, while Norway was at 10 times that at around 500 billion. And people in Alaska were eager at that time to learn and see what lessons Alaskans could learn and apply back at home. And so if you fast forward today, Alaska's fund sits at about 86 billion and Norway is at 2 trillion, and individual investors are seeing their own stock portfolios hit unprecedented heights. So during this hour, we're going to hear directly from people running the world's biggest and most transparent sovereign wealth fund and see what ideas Alaskans, and maybe even us as individuals, investors can borrow and learn. So we're going to start right away directly from Oslo, Norway, Roar Wold, who will be followed by Paul Marcussen in New York. I'm going to ask them a couple of questions and before going, like Siobhan said, to live questions from some Alaskans and read some of your Q&A box. So let's go right over to Roar. Takk for sist, as they say in Norway, which means it's great to see you again. Thank you for the last time. Over to you, Roar.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me all right? Perfect. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to present our favorite topic, the Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global. I'll just going to share my presentation with you, and then we'll start. Can you see this all right, everyone?
Looks good.
That's good. Okay, perfect. Thank you again. The Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global, that is the official name of our savings fund, basically, for all Norwegians and all generations to come. Both myself and Paul, we represent what is called Norges Bank Investment Management. The name basically comes from the fact that we are a part of the Norwegian Central Bank, but I will come back to that. Now, this picture is actually what will face you if you open up our webpage. And we also have another feature on that webpage, and that is we have this ticket. It's actually a number that is a live number of the value of the fund. So every Norwegian can go into our webpage and have a look at how much money it is. And it is quite a lot of money. And below that number, you can see basically why Paul and I go to work every day. We basically work to safeguard and build financial wealth for future generation. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story, because Norway is a pretty young nation. We got our independence only back in 1905. We have been in a union with our neighbors Sweden and Denmark for hundreds of years. And we were pretty much not really a wealthy country. And then I'm going to bring you back to the year of 1969, because 1969 was not only the year where Neil Armstrong took his first step on the moon, but it was also a year where this rig platform or drilling platform were out in the North Sea, just south of Norway. This drilling platform is called the Ocean Viking, and it belonged to the US company Phillips Petroleum. Now, for some years, international oil companies had been drilling for oil in the North Sea, but with no success, really. They couldn't find anything. I mean, there are rough weathers and a little bit of a difficult conditions. So most countries had actually pulled out. Shell, British Petroleum, all these had pulled out. They had started searching other places, but Phillips Petroleum still had some wells to drill or some attempts to make because of the agreement they had made with the Norwegian government. And they were also not able to rent this drilling platform out to other places. So they continued drilling and drilling and drilling. And then one day, or one night actually, one October night in 1969, a Norwegian oil platform worker called Ståle Salvesen, or Salvi, which was his nickname by his US colleagues, was waking up and was given a task. But let's hear this with his own voice.
Du, Salvi, du får gå bort og vekke Ed Seabourn. For meg, 2:00 om natta. Han likte ikke det. Så jeg banket jo på, og så sier han, God damn it, Salvi. What's the time? Så er jeg cirka 2. Jesus Christ. You need a hell of a good reason to wake me up at 2:00 in the morning. Så tok han på seg oldefaren sin morgenkåpe. Tøfler, pyjamas, rett ut, uten hjelm, rett inn. Da hadde det økt på, vet du, dette her. Da kom han inn, kikket han meg opp i sekken, og så begynte han å jodle. Og han forstod, det var olje i det, vet du, selvfølgelig. Og da luktet det mye mer også.
So there was a really good reason for Ståle Salvesen to wake up Mr. Ed Seabourn. They had just found oil in the North Sea, and they would a little bit later realize that they have found Ekofisk. Up until then, the largest offshore oil field ever to be found. And a few months later, on the day before Christmas Eve, the Norwegian government got a call from Phillips Petroleum telling them that you can now officially call yourself an oil nation. Now, what a Christmas gift, huh? That was for the Norwegian people. Or was it? Now, Norwegian politicians at that time knew that small economies and small countries that finds a vast natural resource doesn't necessarily perform that well. Corruption, the rest of the economy could get destroyed, and it could basically just turn the whole or a small society upside down, finding this kind of wealth. A few years earlier, Holland had found gas out in the North Sea, and The Economist gave that a name later on. It was called the Dutch disease, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. And the Dutch disease was basically that this vast natural resource craved out the rest of the economy. They basically became too dependent on this revenue. And when the gas was gone, Holland came into serious troubles. And this is what Norwegian politicians at that time were worried about, even though they were happy we had found oil. I also need to stress that no one had any idea on how much oil we were going to find on the Norwegian continental shelf. But looking into the history, the first discovery of oil in the North Sea in 1969 and production starts in 1979. Now, Norwegian politicians wanted to put out some sort of a framework on how to work on this. So it was produced a very short and easy, so to speak, white paper in 1974 that was named The Role of the Petroleum Activity in Norwegian Society. And again, let me stress that this was very, very early. No one had any idea what this was going to be about. The most important thing about this white paper is that it stated that the revenue from the oil was something that was going to benefit the society as a whole. One of the things that made the groundwork for the fact that we were able to tax the oil companies pretty heavily, while other countries had sort of let just the big players loose in their oil fields and didn't really get that much revenue out of it. The other thing was this weird sentence: the petroleum industry shall contribute to a qualitatively better society. They were worried that all the money that would come from the oil revenue would change the Norwegian society too fast and to too much of an extent. So these were like very sort of basic rules that I would say both created a framework for how we managed to cope with oil, but also later when we had so much money that we needed to put it into a fund. I would say the basics here are pretty much the same. It should be this should be something that every Norwegian benefited from. The many, not the few. Right, let's just look at a few important dates in the history of the oil fund. A report isn't that normally not that exciting, but in 1983 is sort of the first time someone thinks of what to do with all the money that comes from the oil revenue. Again, back to we're afraid of too much money into the economy will basically destroy it. So the Tempo Committee reports, and Tempo stands for how fast should we extract oil, started to think about the fact that we should put some of this money aside. But it was a long and hard way from there until the actual fund was established. Why? There wasn't really anyone imagine that a politician with the access to money wouldn't spend them. The whole idea of having politicians that don't spend the money they have access to was kind of a little bit ridiculous. So it was actually the politicians themselves that forced a little bit through the establishment of the fund. And the fund was established just by law in the Norwegian Parliament in 1990. Now, it was still going to take 6 years until the first deposit into the fund. So the skeptical people were actually right. The politicians continued to spend the money. But then in 1996, this document was signed, perhaps one of the most important documents in Norwegian history. This is the first deposit into the fund, almost 2 billion Norwegian kroners. And as I show you from the teller at our webpage, it is now 21,000 billion kroners. So it was a good idea, this piece of paper. From 1996 on, it is still just part of the normal central bank operations. But in 1998, they establishes the place that I work, Norges Bank Investment Management, an own part of the central bank that will work with only this. And that brings me to our governance model, which is a little bit special, because the Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global is a political construction, but it's not a political tool. So what do I mean by that? The Norwegian Parliament, the politicians, sets a strategy. The Minister of Finance creates a mandate, which basically are pretty detailed, but still it says where we can invest and in what we can invest in, first and foremost. Paul will come back to that a little bit later. But then that mandate is given to the central bank and the governor of the central bank, which is the board of the fund, and then down to us doing the actual operations in Norges Bank Investment Management. Now, this sounds, how can I say that the fund is not a political tool when it's actually decided what we should do by the politicians? Well, the point is that the politicians does not intervene in our daily business. And that's very, very important. As soon as they do that, it will be very difficult. So if a country comes to us and asks for, well, couldn't you just invest in A, B, or C? Well, that's really not up to them. It's more up to us. And in the mandate, we are basically, at least part of us is an index fund. So it means we follow an index given to us by the Minister of Finance. Now, this is a little bit complicated. Paul will get back to some of these features later, but it's just important for me to stress that the politicians set the strategy and we do the actual day-to-day investments. So the idea is this. The politicians wanted to take off some of the, let's say, risk of the oil prices and put some of the money into the financial markets. And over the long run, we know that there will be less and less oil in the ground. And the idea is that we can keep up with this by investing in the financial markets. And that has worked pretty well. Question is, why don't the Norwegian politicians use more money? Because the fund is growing. Well, that brings me to the last feature in the historical feature I will show you today, and it's called the fiscal rule. It was sort of the father of the fiscal rule is our current Minister of Finance, actually, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, who some of you perhaps know as the former Secretary General of NATO. But in 2001, the Norwegian Parliament agreed upon the fiscal rule. This is the Norwegian Parliament. And the fiscal rule is basically as easy as the politicians shouldn't use more than 3% of the fund annually. Why 3%? We basically calculated that if you find a number that is lower than the expected average return, if the politician doesn't spend more than the expected annual return, the fund will basically last forever. You follow that logic, right? So, and they have been able to stick with this. It has been 4, now it's 3. During the pandemic, for example, where it was need to spend a little bit more money, it was up to 4, but then they took it down to 3 again. Now, this sounds great, right? But the fact is that the size of the fund today means that even though the politicians does not spend even 3%, they spend about 2.7%, the fund accounts for 1/4 on the annual state budget. 1/4. So that's quite a lot of money. And of course, as you can imagine, if the fund were suddenly to decrease a lot because of some kind of a financial crisis or wars or anything like that, well, then there will be less money for the politicians to spend, even within this rule. But that's the point, and they've been pretty good at following this rule since they invented it in 2001. Why is that? How have they been able to do that? Well, it probably has to do with Norwegian political culture, I would say. On this picture, you see from the left our CEO, Mr. Nicolai Tangen. And then you see a former Minister of Finance from the Labour Party, Sigbjørn Johnsen. He was the guy who signed that first piece of paper, by the way, the first deposit. Then next to him, Kristin Halvorsen was Minister of Finance for 8 years for the Socialist Leftist Party. And on the right, also Minister of Finance for 8 years, Ms. Siv Jensen, who was representing what we could call the right-wing party. Not a right-wing party as you perhaps know it, but in a Norwegian political sense, it's a right-wing party. The reason why I'm showing you this picture is that the secret behind the success of the fund is basically that these three people and all other politicians have been able to agree on these rules they have put on themselves. They have been able to not spend more money than they had agreed upon. And that's, to me, pretty remarkable. The picture here is actually from a discussion where they were discussing that. And all of them were worried about spending too much money, even though they're from the left part of the politics, the center, the middle part, and the right-wing part. So it's probably the most important thing about the story, except from, of course, building a professional investment organization and all that kind of things that Paul will probably mention more about later. The politicians are our owners representing the people. And if they wanted to spend this fund, they could easily do it. But they have chosen not to. And I'm going to just end with showing you a short video clip with a few of the finance ministers, all representing different parties, talking about very important features from their point of view of the fund. Listen to this.
I think many experts told us that it was a bit naive to believe that a democratic society and a democratic system could manage such a big cash flow in a sustainable, responsible way. But the experience so far in Norway is that we have been able to do exactly that.
It is important pillars in managing the fund. That the fund is transparent, that investments are responsible, and that we have ethical guidelines. It really makes a difference.
I think the size of the fund that we see today has exceeded all our expectations.
The fund is the people's savings, which means that it needs to invest in a long-term perspective to make sure that we can benefit living generations and coming generations.
So I guess Siv Jensen at the end there sums it up very well. The point of this fund is to save or create and safeguard financial wealth for present and future generations. Hence the spending rule and the fact that we don't spend more money than we actually earn would, at least in principle, say that this fund will last forever. So our main mission is the highest possible return. That's what we're aiming for. We're a financial investor, but we do it on behalf of the Norwegian people. So that was basically my presentation on the history. I'm looking forward to your questions after Paul have done his part.
Thank you, Roar. That was really a great overview and background. I can't wait to hear more about this transparency and ethics. So we're going to take it over to Paul, who I can see is joining us from New York. Okay, why are you in New York? And tell us what you do and more about the fund. Over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, let me go through that a little bit. Let me see if I can get up my slides here. Give me 1 second. Okay, I believe it should be up there now. So I actually joined the fund in 2002. So you remember the rule about spending 3% of the fund came into place in 2001. I didn't believe that for a second when I joined, and I thought the fund would be empty in a matter of 5 years. Politicians like to build buildings, universities, hospitals, roads, bridges. Norway is very much like Alaska. There's a lot of remote settlements, remote islands that needs bridges, and I was convinced the money would be gone, but that I would have 5 years of good experience, etc. Interestingly enough, they were able to sort of be careful with the money, the politicians. And we've invested it, cautiously and decently. But the US operation of Norges Bank, so the central bank that we're part of, actually stretches back much further. So we have been, one second. So we've actually been investing in North American markets for 83 years. And that long history has stayed with the fund's office in New York the whole time, and we've been active investors the whole time period, different people, of course. But a little bit back to how our investments in the US started and where we came from. So I'm not sure if you guys know where this is. A hint is that this is the middle of the Oslo fjord. If you go up on the screen, you come towards Germany and Denmark. You go down from this and you come to Oslo, the city of Oslo. And you can see that this is a military fortress in the middle of the fjord. And you can also see that this is for those that have been in the military, this is a very easily defendable area. It's tough for a ship to pass by this. It carries special meaning for me because I was actually here in the military. I'm not sure if you see my mouse, but I stayed in the middle of the screen here in one of the rooms, and they used to march us back and forth on this parade grounds you see in the front of this thing. So April 8th in 1942, this ship sailed in the Oslo fjord, and this is the Blücher, which is the most modern German ship at the time. And as you can see, it's laying over on its side. That's because on the island there's torpedo batteries that sunk this ship, and the cannons were hitting it. The ship later sunk. On board this ship was a team of soldiers that were due to go to the central bank in Norway to take the gold, which is something you do in an invasion. You go take the gold. Luckily for us, the ship was sunk before it got so far. Of course, the Germans were landing at the airports and other places and were going into Oslo. The central bank governor got notified that the Germans were coming, and he got together a few guys. They went down to the basement of the central bank and started carrying up the gold, which had been prepared ahead of time. They were carrying it up, loading it onto trucks and lorries, and they would keep going up and down. Carrying gold is heavy, so it took them much longer than they expected. But they got it on board the trucks and then started driving out of town. At the time they were driving out of town, the Germans were actually already marching down the main street, which is called Karl Johan in Oslo. And we drove past them and across the mountains. And eventually it made it on board these fishing boats or these little ships, which carried the gold further up north in Norway and eventually over to England. It went into the Bank of England first, but then the Germans were threatening England as well. So it was decided by the government in exile to ship all the gold from London to the US. And it was shipped across the Atlantic, went on to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and later on to Fort Knox. And they needed someone to look after the gold. So they hired a local emigrated Norwegian in New York, which set up the Norges Bank office. However, looking after gold is terribly boring. It doesn't do anything, it just lays there, and there's basically very little to do. So he started investing some of the cash flow that was also coming to him. Norwegian ships were shipping war material from the US to England at the time, and the ship owners got paid, and we were doing the payment implementation for the ship owners. He started investing in fixed income papers, first just treasuries and then commercial papers, etc., etc. And ever since that time, we have been investing from the New York office. First for the war sailing fund, and then later on for the reserves, the country reserves, and since 1998 for the what we call the oil fund, which is the pension fund global. So the office is about 100 employees currently. You can see where they're from and what areas they work from. About 40% are Norwegians working here, 40% are Americans, and about 20% are from other countries. And as you can see, it's a mini version of the overall fund with all the different areas represented here. So what do we invest in? And then Roar probably hasn't seen this slide yet, but I figured it would be good to compare it with something else to get an impression of what we invest in. And I figured, why not compare it to the permanent fund? And here you see that. So the Alaska fund is on the right and Norges Bank's on the left. So you can see that our asset allocation mix is very, very simple. It is equities, listed stocks, basically. Tiny bit in renewable infrastructure. Then we have bonds, both government bonds and company bonds. And then we have a little bit of real estate. If you compare that to the right to the Alaska fund, you can see that they have about half their assets in equities, some of which are listed and some of which are, so 32% are listed equities and 18% is unlisted equities. So about 50% equities. And then they have many more other asset classes. There's public fixed income like we have, but they also have private fixed income. They have much more in real estate. They have absolute return, etc. So I have to say, as a financial person, the allocation on the right actually makes much more sense if you want to diversify the fund. However, in terms of presenting it and explaining it to the public and being very transparent about it, the allocation to the left is quite easy to explain. People understand what a listed stock is and what bonds are. So it's very easy to explain. You can also see that asset allocation on the left is quite risky for a whole nation to have 71% of their assets in stocks, which swings a lot. We can do that because the fund has gotten as big as it has. So even if we have a down year, we should be able to pay our annual enough to the budget to keep them going. I would think of the fund as sort of an endowment for the entire nation in many ways. So where in the world are these assets invested? No, not the slide I want to show. So basically, currently about half the assets are in the US, and about 30% are in Europe, and 20% is in the rest of the world, roughly speaking. So it's quite well diversified geographically. And you could say maybe the North America portion is high at roughly half the assets. But that is just the world we live in terms of what companies are big and successful, etc. And these are global companies, which has presence around the world. Then I'm going to skip on to one final slide. It's very important for the Norwegian public that the assets are invested responsibly. We can do that in several ways. We can exclude companies that is just not acceptable for us to invest in. That's one thing. That's actually a tiny portion. We express clear expectation for the boards of the companies we invest in to try to make them run the assets in what we consider a responsible way. We monitor and engage the companies, of course, and we vote and have dialogue with the companies in terms of implementing what we think is the best way of running the money. This is all financially oriented. This is not some woke agenda where we're trying to change the world. This is actually, we have to manage the assets, not for the next 6 months, but for the next 6, 10, 15 decades. And in order to do that, we have to have them run properly and well. So that's essentially the key things here. A huge chunk, like Roar mentioned, is actually indexed when it comes to I'm just going to go back a couple slides. When it comes to the equity portion here, a huge chunk of that is actually indexed and run like an index fund. Then there's some active equities. Fixed income is quite actively run. And then there's some small portions in real estate and unlisted infrastructure. Only about 5% of the fund is managed by external fund managers, while 95% of the fund is managed by internal portfolio managers. So thank you. I'm looking forward to some questions.
Okay, what a great overview. I'm so excited. So I've got a lot of questions. I'm not going to take up the whole rest of the hour because we have questions coming in. But let's start there where you talk about the asset investment and allocations. What percentage of your investments are in United States companies? You said half your portfolio. I've also heard some terms about a percentage of all companies. Maybe you can just talk a little bit more about your investment in US companies.
Yeah, so roughly speaking, we own about 2.5% of all the companies in. Roy probably has the data better on this than I do, actually.
Sorry,
our ownership percentage in the US and around the world.
It's around the world is 1.5%. In Europe, it's actually 2.5%. I mean, average ownership in every company in the world, actually. But when it comes to our investments, more than half of them is in Northern America, which basically includes Canada. So we're pretty well invested in the US.
And is there a way for us to see what companies you're actually invested in?
It is. I mean, if you go to our webpage, you can we reveal twice a year our holdings in different companies. So we're putting quite a lot of. I mean, it's very important for us to be very transparent, and the reason for that is basically every Norwegian needs to know or wants to know where we are invested, in what kind of companies we are invested, how much and stuff. So we reveal that twice a year. So you can basically go to our webpage and search up all the companies, all the properties, and the fixed income that we own in all the countries we are invested in, also the US, of course.
I find that really, really interesting. I love that slide you put up, Paul, where you looked at Alaska and Norway, and I hope we can share that on the World Affairs Council website. I hadn't seen that before. It is so, so, so great. My understanding, and Angela, who's going to come up next, can probably tell us more, but my understanding is Alaska does publish those broad swaths, how much investment is in real estate and how much is in stock, but Norway goes down to the actual individual investments. So,
and I would say one thing, sort of, when we set up the fund, Alaska was one of our role models in many ways. We had someone to look at how has this been done in the past. The one major structural difference is that you guys have the dividends that goes to all the citizens, whereas in our case, it just goes into the state budget, essentially. But in terms of setting up the governance structure, the way we invest, Alaska was clearly a place we looked to when we set up the entire construction.
And I remember that so clearly. I remember Norway sending MBA students to Alaska all the time to learn from Alaska and what we were doing. I don't know how much of those lessons were taken back. I think you said, nah, we don't want to do that. But it was really interesting to watch that as that took place. So my question for you is, with this transparency, what made you decide to be so transparent, and how has that transparency paid off? I'm wondering if that is something that Alaskans could possibly learn as far as our permanent fund goes.
Yeah, I can probably add something to this, but the transparency is important for the anchoring in the people, essentially. Our mandate comes from Parliament. We will only have the faith of the Norwegian public through the politicians if we deliver the returns and if people understand what we invest in. So the transparency is truly tied to sort of maintaining the long-term nature of the fund by making it understandable to people. And as I mentioned, this slide with the different in allocation. It is quite clear that the Alaskan fund is much more diversified in many axes. Ours is a higher risk proposition, and we are aiming for quite high returns, of course, but you take risks when you do that.
Oh, what a great segue to our first person who's going to come on screen to ask a question, Angela Rodell, former CEO of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. Angela, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for doing this. I think it's really important, especially after so many years, that we continue to have these conversations and try to figure out what lessons we've learned in the intervening years that we can both take from each other. And one of the things I loved, I didn't really know about your history, but I love that 1969 was the key year for Alaska as well. It's when oil was found on the North Slope. And so that whole idea of how do we preserve some of these resources for future generations becomes so meaningful. In terms of transparency, I think it's the struggle that we always have. Alaska has been really good. You can find every single stock ticker that Alaska invests in and how much it invests in that public stock ticker. I think where Alaska kind of gets dinged on its transparency is in the private market space because of the confidentiality rules that surround private markets. And I suspect that's been the challenge as to why, because I do know that you guys have looked at getting into private markets over the years to try and help diversify away, especially when you get so big and have such large volumes of money that you need to put to work. I guess one of the questions, and you did a really good job of talking about it, is talking about political pressure, the consensus around it. I think Alaska, though, is really struggling as we move forward and move away from being such a resource generating state in the way we once were. And you all have sort of faced it with your production decline curve and sort of moving away even more aggressively away from fossil fuels from an ethical and investment standpoint. I guess I'd like you to talk, if you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit more about, what are the guardrails that matter most to you? And then how do you explain the losses, right? So how do you get people comfortable with the idea that you could take a huge loss when, but your government is, I want to point out for anybody listening, is a lot less dependent on the fund than Alaska is. So Alaska takes 5% and it funds almost over 50% versus the 25% of government that you mentioned. For either one of you, thank you.
Yeah, the system is kind of a fragile system. We are really dependent on both the politicians and the people trusting us in knowing what we're doing and trusting the governance system, basically. When it comes to what we have tried to warn for several years what could possibly happen if the fund decreases a lot. But every time we says it, the international market just keeps going up. So it's a little bit difficult. But what we're starting with now is we're starting to publish scenarios to try to explain to people, okay, if a certain thing happen, let's say an AI bubble or a major conflict, how could that possibly inflict the fund? And try to, in a pedagogical way, explain to people and to our politicians what could happen. We are invested in more than 9,000 companies or 8,500 companies all over the world. So we are basically in it. If something happens, we're going to go down. with the international market, but also up, right? So we're in this no matter, and we're so big that everything that happens affects us. So we try to tell people that, but to be honest, we haven't really experienced it. The only time we have experienced it was in the financial crisis in 2008, and guess what? Because of our rather slow bureaucratic models of decision making when it comes to the strategy. Just before the financial crisis hit us, the Norwegian politicians decided to increase our share of stocks from was it 40 to 60%, Paul? Right, yeah. And so they decided that, and we went straight into the financial crisis. So it looked like a very bad idea, and there was quite a lot of discussions in the Norwegian public about it. But what happened is that we had a steady inflow from oil. The oil prices were good, and we managed to buy cheap stocks. And when the market came back, the fund really, really, really increased. While a different investor probably would have to react in a different way. So it's like our long-term perspectives has treated us very well. But again, we don't really know what will happen with how the population views us if we're going into something of a downturn for a longer period of time, because we have actually not experienced it. So that's the I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Paul, but it's basically that's where we are now. We tell every year that be afraid, the fund could decrease, and then it just keeps on going. So it's a pedagogically a little bit of a difficult message to give, but we'll keep on saying that because we think it's important for people to have thought about what will happen if markets go down for a longer period of time.
Thank you, Angela, for that question. You know, I really love how we have you from Norway talking with us here in Alaska with two sovereign wealth funds having this conversation. I'm just curious, as the World Affairs Council, do you ever have these conversations with Alaska or with China or with Kuwait or Qatar, other countries that have sovereign wealth funds? Do you have this best practice or exchange of ideas going back and forth?
So we do talk to the different sovereign wealth funds out there on a friendly basis. We are each very different in the way we're structured and what's important to us. In many ways, actually, the Alaska Permanent Fund is more similar to us than most, given that we're both democratically based, etc. And we face these questions like we just talked about, you know, how will people react if it goes down, etc. We probably have better discussions with the Canadian pension plans, etc., which is not formally sovereign wealth funds, but are government investment entities. It's more commonality there than some of the other sovereign wealth funds.
Well, I hope these conversations continue with Alaska for many years to come. I'm going to go right to a question that is here in our chat box. Great question. It says, "Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Norway is a great example to the world. Can you discuss if the Norway Fund has constitutional language that the resources of Norway belong to the residents in the present and future? Are there any public representatives involved with the management board or the fund?" So two questions, really. So is there any constitutional language that the resources of Norway belongs to the residents and the present and future? And are there any public representatives involved with the management board for the fund?
Roy might know more about this than me.
Yeah,
but there's
you have
a couple of things.
I mean, as I said earlier in the presentation, I mean, the fund is established in the parliament by a law. So it's established by law how this should work out. It's not necessarily in the constitution, I don't think, but it's established by law. But of course, the politicians are actually able to change this whenever they want. I mean, that's also why I said this system is a little bit of a fragile. I think it would be hard to get it into a constitution so to speak, but it is made by it is in the Norwegian law on how we would deal with this. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? It was
The second part is, are there any public, just
right.
normal people who are representatives involved with the management board of the fund?
Well, the management board of the fund is actually we share the board with the central bank. So there's no, except from two representatives from the employees, there's no like ordinary people represented. I mean, the way we do this is that the ordinary people in Norway is represented through the politicians in the parliament. That's the way it works. But we do share something called the supervisory board. That's actually a construction for the central bank, but it is often former politicians that has a specific job to revise the central bank and the fund. But no, there is no like ordinary citizens in the board. It's not. It's they decide on the fund through their politicians at the parliament.
Okay, and now we'd like to bring on another person to ask a question in person. Glo, if you could accept the request to come on screen. We have here in Alaska a town called Petersburg, which is considered Little Norway. And if the two of you have not been to Little Norway in Alaska, you need to come, especially during 17th of May. They have a fantastic Mayfest. And the person who has been in charge of this for many, many years is going to ask our next question. So Glo, if you could turn your video screen on so we can see your beautiful face from Petersburg, Alaska, and unmute. You have the floor to ask the next question. Okay, it looks like she's having some issues, but Glo, just keep on trying to unmute yourself and put your video screen on. When I see you, I'll let you come in. Until that time, I'll come right back in here. So you talked, Ruar, about the fund being at an unprecedented level and it growing and growing and growing. We're seeing that as individuals with our stock portfolios. And some say that we have a bubble, and when you have a bubble, you can have a burst. So as an individual investor who are also nervous, and for Alaskans and the Alaska Permanent Fund, what do you think about this growth? Do you think we're in a bubble that's about to burst? I know you have no crystal ball, but you're managing the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. What do you think?
I don't know.
It's tough to say, tough to tell. The markets are very expensive. There's no doubt. It's gone up for many years. But the only good advice we can have, which is similar to what we do, is we have a fixed asset allocation, and we keep rebalancing back to that allocation. So we tend to be 70% equities, and if our share of equities goes up to 75 or higher, we will bring it back down to 70. So I think the advice would have to be, find a level that you're comfortable with, and if you over time slide away from that, then bring it back to that level. Timing the market is close to impossible.
So we shouldn't be someone who tries to figure out the right time and get sequencing correct.
No, I wouldn't do that, but I wouldn't sort of let the markets themselves dictate how big different portions become either. So if something becomes bigger than it was originally planned to be, then I would scale it back into a reasonable level.
Interesting. Okay, we'll go to Glo. It looks like your screen's not working, but we can hear her. So Glo, on to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa, for allowing us to have this and the Alaska World Affairs Council. I really appreciate this topic. Lisa introduced me as coming from Petersburg, Alaska's Little Norway, and I was raised by Norwegians, and I have to say our community has its own little permanent fund that we've had invested and actually have an economic basis for a lot of projects in our community, as well as having a public foundation where we have raised millions of dollars and have it invested to hopefully take care of future generations. I'm wondering about Norway's ability to publicly educate? Do you have in your budget annual education? I feel like in Alaska, we just kind of think that our politicians are taking care of it and the investment is kind of done in secret and there's a hope and a dream. But many of us benefit from like the 529, a college education program that the state has set up through our university. And it does really well on behalf of our school kids. And I'm wondering if how much of your budget goes to just educating annually the work you're doing so that new generations, it goes without saying that this is the hope and dream of the future. Thank you.
Well, we don't do that like directly. We work through, I mean, I work in the communications department. So, I mean, we do a lot of what I would call normal communication works through social media and interviews and stuff. When we had our new CEO, Nicolai Tangen, he's a very like public person. So there's from time to time a lot of debate about the fund, but it's not like we, for example, do have a part in the educational system or anything. That's up to the different schools to decide upon. But I think we have realized that we need to do something about that because we know through when we measure both the knowledge of the fund and also the reputation, we can see that among younger generations, the knowledge and the reputation is not as good as with the older parts of the population. So that is something that we are working on, and it goes with the understanding of what this is. And also the risk, of course, but also the how should I put it? The importance of this for them when they grow up. So probably next year, when there's 30 years since the first deposit into the fund, we will have a reach out to Norwegian high schools. In order to try to put this on the agenda. But we don't really have it's all in the ordinary like communication budget. Unfortunately, I don't have an arm that reaches all the way into the educational department. I wish I had, but I don't.
That sounds like actually quite a bit of outreach. I don't remember growing up in Alaska, that sort of education coming to our high schools. But with that, we're going to go over to Ed Martin in Anchorage, Alaska, to ask the next question.
Hello, gentlemen, and I want to thank Alaska World Affairs Council for allowing me an opportunity to speak. I am a second generation. Prior to statehood, my dad was one of those homesteaders, of which you guys probably know a little bit about. It conquered the West, should I say, and I'm proud that my father was part of that. He acquired some land. It's interesting. It's an interesting story I could tell you about this because my dad didn't get his mineral rights under a federal homestead. It fell in a period of time of which the state was being formed and his prove-up time. And so he completed his application. And then they said, oh, well, go see the state because they top filed you. And as a result, in your best interest, and you'll get a state patent. Well, of course, statehood was established in a manner in which our mineral rights are passed on to the state in a special section of our Constitution. You guys effectively have done something that didn't require a constitutional amendment or a constitutional act in its creation with regards to your natural resources. I'm keenly aware of how Alaska has benefited, of course. I've lived here for over 65 years. I'm a great-grandfather now of 5 generations. My concern, and when you talked about that downturn or downturns in the economy and how it affected the investments, of course, my dad was keenly observant of that too. And in '98, we had 26 billion in our our permanent fund being invested. In 99, we had lost $2 billion. My dad was part of a movement in the state to get an advisory vote, in which we voted to advise our government that not to touch our dividend. They have been taking portions of our dividend, much more after a governor vetoed a bill to give us our full dividend. And since then, it's been nothing but politics. In fact, the politics is so bad, sirs, that we don't have accountability now with our permanent fund. There was bylaws established to be bonded as trustees, and they've done away with those bonding requirements this last spring.
And what's your question, Ed? We're running out of time.
My question is this. I've done an analysis of both your fund and Alaska's permanent fund, and I find that you guys are doing 16 times better in the management of your fund than the permanent fund in Alaska is. Maybe you can give us some advice as to how we can better manage our permanent fund and get accountability back. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm in terms of the accountability for us, it's sort of been it is somewhat similar to Alaska in that it's established through parliament, the state assembly and who controls it, etc. And we don't have dividends; it just all goes to the government essentially. I'm not going to opine on how good of a job or not Alaska's done. I would say that we've had a very, very big equity exposure through time, and stocks have gone up. So compared to most people, we've done quite well, actually. But we have taken higher risk along the way here. And then in terms of how we actually manage the fund, a huge chunk of the fund is index fund, so it's more like Vanguard than an actively managed fund, which I think suits the Norwegian population quite well.
Okay, and then just to wrap it up, where can we find out more information about your fund and where you're invested? Do you have a website you can share with us?
Yeah, our website, we put a lot of emphasis and effort into the website because that's our most important tool for the Norwegian population to find information about what they own. So it's really, really important. So you'll find basically all the information that there is. I mean, you won't find you won't find Paul's investment strategies, but you will find our mandate, which is the broadest strategy, and you will find everything from how we do the investments to what we own, but also a lot on responsible investment, for example, how we think about that. So our webpage, nbim.no/en for English, you will get quite a lot of information. Yeah, if you can't find anything, please reach out to us, and we'll try to help you out because to us that webpage is our gold when it comes to transparency.
Thank you for putting it in English. And over to you, Siobhan.
Wow. I always wish that we had more time, especially after this conversation. So again, I just want to thank our speakers for joining and sharing their insights and expertise, and to Lise Kristiansen for moderating this discussion today. And to all of our attendees, we're incredibly grateful to have you join us. Programs like this are only possible because of the support of our members and community, and we hope that you continue to engage with us as we bring more World Affairs programming to Alaska. Before we close, I want to share a couple of upcoming opportunities we have going on this week. This Thursday at noon, we'll be at the BP Energy Center for Navigating the Middle East, Insights with Ambassador Romanowski and General Ralston. And Thursday evening, we will meet at Cork and Hops in Eagle River for our December book club. You can find more information and register online on our website. On behalf of everyone at the Council, thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again this week. Thank you all.
Thank you.